Hi, this is Skip Stewart, Vice President and Chief Improvement Officer for Baptist Memorial Healthcare. This little blue brain here has become synonymous with the Baptist management system. And at the bottom of the blue brain, it says, show me your thinking, because we want good thinking around purpose, people, and process. This video series is a part of an overall Improvement Kata workshop. So what is a kata? Well, a kata is a routine you practice, so its pattern becomes an automatic habit that gives you some new skills. We have individuals all throughout Baptist at different disciplines, at different levels, learning how to think scientifically as they experiment their way forward towards really big and important goals. So here's the four-step improvement kata model. A couple things to bring attention to is it is an iterative process, meaning it's a series of steps you repeat, tweaking and improving along the way. On the far right is our company logo with the word vision inside. But the first important step is important step number one, the challenge. A challenge is typically 52 weeks out into the future. It's a really big goal, many times multifaceted, but it's a strategic imperative. It's a game changer. It's not what we can work on to improve, it's what we must work on. Now, each step is going to frame the next step. So important step number two is the current condition. Where are we at today in light of that challenge? Important step number three, the next target condition. The magic word there is the word next, because it implies there will be multiple target conditions on our way to the challenge. If the challenge is 52 weeks into the future, then the target condition is going to be about 2 to 3 weeks. And then important step number four, PDSA, plan, do, study, adjust. Or you can think of the word experiment. You're experimenting through one obstacle at a time on your way to the target condition. And this four-step improvement kata model is a meta routine. A routine that stays the same regardless of the circumstances, a routine way of acting and thinking. Important step number one, the challenge. Important step number two, current condition. Important step number three, target condition. And important step number four, PDSA. But a couple things to bring attention to is that you cannot reach the overall challenge right away. The path to the target condition is not predictable or straight. And finally, as you're moving towards your next target condition by experimenting against one obstacle at a time, you're going to be making adjustments based on what you learn. But to operationalize that, we have to have the coaching kata. We're not going to get into coaching in this video, but we'll get into that in the actual workshop. But this is a little card that participants get front and back on learning how to coach. Here's some of the players in the game. We have the learner that has a team that they're working on. We have a coach that's working with that learner on a regular basis. And then we have a second coach. We'll talk more about that in the workshop. The reason we need these skills is that my brain and your brain naturally makes assumptions. Another way to think about that is that our brain tends to jump to conclusions. See, we have these knowledge thresholds. That's the point where we have no data and we have no facts and we're just guessing, and our brain jumps to conclusion. Our brain fills in the blanks automatically. Our brain creates these feelings of certainty based on the bits of information it receives. We often don't even notice the knowledge threshold because our brain is filling in the blanks. So the way that we're going to fight against that is scientific thinking. And here's the four steps. Important step number one, the challenge. Important step number two, the current condition. Important step number three, the target condition. And important step number four, PDSA. But remember, our brain jumps to conclusions. We have these knowledge threshold. A way to think about that green line there is it's the limit of what we know for sure. And we're going to have many of those as we're experimenting towards our target condition. So we need these four steps that we keep talking about. We need this new mental model. We need this new meta routine to fight against this tendency to jump to conclusions. Scientists actually say that there's about 180 cognitive biases. You say, well, what's a cognitive bias? Well, that's an inherent kind of blind spot that reduces thinking accuracy and results in inaccurate and often irrational conclusions. One author said our tendency to jump to conclusions is so deeply wired in our brains that we're not even aware we're doing it. So think about this meta routine that we're trying to develop here. As Mike Rother said, scientists don't change how they work with each new research topic. The trick is to develop well-worn mental circuits, not for solutions, but for a means of developing solutions. See, this meta routine, the basic pattern is always going to be the same regardless of the goal. So regardless of what you're working on, the how you're working on it stays the same. So the meta routine tells us how to proceed. That meta routine is the four-step improvement kata model. How are we going to create that? Well, we believe that one answer, what we've seen so far, is to take practical scientific thinking and combine it with daily routines of deliberate practice. And what we have discovered is by doing this, we can produce scientific thinking in anybody. So right now we're doing what we call passive learning. Videos and books and workshop, those are all great, but you don't actually develop skill. We develop skill as we get out into the real world, we practice it, we make mistakes, and we learn from those mistakes. So there's the four-step improvement kata model. Once again, I want to go a little deeper into the first step, the challenge. To do that, I'm going to change the paradigm. I'm going to put this model on the side. And we're going to think about the challenge being like a big funnel. You have this really big 52-week challenge, and the question is, how do you get from a 52-week or more challenge to daily experimentation, or at least as close as possible to daily? Well, let's think about that some more. So there's our 52-week challenge. You're going to have many focus processes that make up that challenge. And so here's an example of a 52-week challenge from an ED. And you can hit pause if you want to read this more. Let's go back to our example. So we'll pick one of the focus processes, and then we'll narrow that down to a target condition that's only 2 to 3 weeks out into the future. And then we'll narrow that down to the obstacles that are in front of that target condition. And then we'll pick one of those obstacles and we'll start experimenting on that on a regular basis. So where you can see a narrowing process. If we just try to go from the current condition and go straight to the challenge, and just work on an obstacle that we think is in front of the challenge, that's going to be kind of like playing whack-a-mole. And that's not an efficient and a good way to do it. So once again, we have many focus processes within a challenge, within this multifaceted challenge. We have many target conditions within a focus process. We have many obstacles to a target condition. And then we have many PDSA cycles to overcome one obstacle. And it's a very iterative process because once again, if we try to just go from the current condition and having an obstacle in front of just the challenge, if we don't have the target condition, you end up getting caught into a trap of playing that whole whack-a-mole. Just to explain a little more what I mean by that, you know how the game works, right? You see or perceive a problem that pops up and we whack it down. Then another, and we get that one too. And then eventually it becomes unmanageable and we're pounding the hammer across the board willy-nilly. Eventually time runs out, the game stops, and we're exhausted and we realize that we've accomplished absolutely nothing. So we're going to go in a little more deeper into these four steps, but as we do, you're going to hear this word called pattern of work. This is how I want you to think about it. Pattern of work. If you've ever played or participated or watched any kind of sporting activities, you'll watch the players play the game. You may notice that some of the players have some unique characteristics to how they play the game, even though they're different than another team that's playing the game. They may have some unique characteristics just for their team. And if you're a coach, you might draw a picture of how they're playing the game now in the current condition. And you may draw another picture of how you want them to play the game into the future. We'll call that the target condition. So when we think about pattern of work, we're thinking about how are we playing the game and how do we want to play the game. So important step number one is the challenge, and it has 4 key points. Key point number 1, date and distant future. Key point number 2, desired pattern of work. Key point number 3, metrics. Key point number 4, start with one focus process. Important step number 2, current condition. It has 5 key points. Key point number 1, actual pattern of work now. Key point number 2, process characteristics now. Key point number 3, current process metrics now. Key point number 4, current outcome metrics now. And finally, key point number 5, understanding linkage of outcome metrics, focus process, and challenge. Important step number 3 is next target condition. It has 5 key points. Key point number 1, date in near future. Key point number 2, desired pattern of work. Key point number 3, process characteristics. Key point number 4, process metrics. Key point number 5, outcome metrics. And then finally, important step number 4, PDSA. It has 4 key points. Against one obstacle of target condition desired pattern of work. Key point number 2, list of what is expected to happen. Key point number 3, list what actually happened. Key point number 4, reflect what did you learn. Important step number 1, let's talk about some of the reasons for those key points. So on key point number 1, date in distant future, that's so that we have an arrival time long term. Key point number 2, desired pattern of work, that's so that we know how we need to play the game to win. Key point number 3, metrics, that's because we need to establish and measure the gap between the current condition, where we're at now, and the challenge. Key point number 4, start with one focused process. That's so that it helps us narrow our focus and see those obstacles more clearly. Once again, a kata is a routine so that you practice, so its pattern becomes an automatic habit that gives you some new skills. You notice I'm bringing attention to the word practice and skills. Skills are only developed by way of practice. What's going to happen when we practice? We're going to create these new neural pathways, new highways in our brain. The behavior will influence the mindset will influence the behavior, and will create a perpetual loop. Or neuroscientists like to say, every time you think or do something, you are more likely to do it again, because it writes and strengthens neural pathways. But as you're developing this skill, even though you may be smiling on the outside, this is how you feel on the inside. Because there's not a lot of energy flowing between the synapses of your brain. It's uncomfortable, but that's okay, because that means you're learning something. This is actually what you want to feel. It means you're building a new neural pathway. So it's normal to feel unnatural and uncomfortable and had to think about it. That means you're learning something. And all throughout Baptist, people are learning how to think scientifically. So until the next video, show me your thinking.